I'm going to talk about two topics, as you can see here, two important topics in Holocaust history. Part of a triad, we might say, that a historian who I'm going to talk about here in a little bit once suggested is an interesting way to understand the Holocaust. That is through the prism of perpetrators, bystanders, and the victims, and the relation of them. Despite the fact that we now have thousands of books on the seemingly every aspect of the Holocaust, in fact, if you do a Library of Congress search, you come up with 16,000 and some. This event largely confined to just 6 years from 1939 to 1945, which claimed the lives of 6 million Jews and likely 14 million other social, political, and sexual enemies of the Reich. This event still remains uncomfortably positioned in our historical collective memory. I'm going to adjust this. This seems kind of weird standing at an angle to me.
What is what you need? You can actually take that out and hold it.
Thank you. Many have noted that this discomfort stems from the realization that the Holocaust was by no means a seemingly unfathomable historical crime, but it was also an unprecedented moral failure in the entirety of Western civilization. As the late Elie Wiesel once noted, what hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander. This binary, this relationship between two groups of historical actors, the perpetrators and the onlookers, is at the center of what I'm going to talk about this evening. When I was trying to decide how to best present this material to you, I asked myself the question, what information would be most useful to you, pedagogically speaking, and most impactful on your students? My idea is, and we'll see if this is a total disaster or not here in a moment, is to give you a very brief overview of how scholarly interpretations of these two groups, perpetrators and bystanders, has evolved over time, and then suggest what a useful assignment might look like that you could use in a classroom, something that could be expanded or contracted to fit. You could tailor fit it. Let us first begin with the perpetrators. And it might be useful to oversimplify here a bit, but I'm going to locate three basic scholarly trends when it comes to this group. And what I'm talking about here is something historians call historiography. That's basically the history of how history is written. So I'm going to tell you the history of how historians have understood perpetrators. And they've done it kind of in three phases. The first phase comes immediately after the end of the Second World War, from roughly 1945 to 1960, a period in which most histories portrayed perpetrators as a collective, monolithic group of fanatics, mostly SS men, who unquestionably followed a few top Nazi leaders, your Himmlers and your Hitlers, and their crazy, irrational, and delusional ideas to their murderous end. This was both an easy and convenient argument, I would argue, as those top Nazis who led Germany astray were now dead. This line of thinking began to change in the 1960s, what I'm calling Phase 2. Let's see, can I get this to work? I can. With the publication of Raoul Hilberg's seminal work in 1961, The Destruction of the European Jews, which must count as one of the most important pieces ever written on the Holocaust, as well as the first comprehensive history of the tragedy. In short, Holocaust studies begin with him. This is ironic, you should know, because when he was working on his dissertation at Columbia, his advisor, Franz Neumann, told him that he shouldn't do a Holocaust topic because nobody wanted to hear it and he would never get a job. That is, he was digging his own grave. In fact, when he published this piece, it was turned down by Columbia Press, Princeton Press, Yad Vashem, all types of important presses because it was problematic for a number of reasons, and maybe I can deal with some of those in the questions afterwards. His dissertation was 400 and some odd pages. This work ultimately is 3 volumes, 2,000 pages, his magnum opus as it was, in which Hilberg used captured German records to detail the systematic, highly bureaucratic annihilation of European Jews, which he argued had its own internal logic, progressed in stages, and was highly compartmentalized. Every person had their own task. Thus, in Hilberg's account of the perpetrators, the operators of the machinery of death, he might call them, were presented as, quote, a remarkable cross-section of German society. This genocide was by no means incomprehensible, but rather an explicable historical event driven largely by faceless bureaucrats and technicians. The staying power of Hilberg's thesis was helped, ironically, as the two rarely saw eye to eye, by the publication of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem in that same year. Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. In this text, Arendt, like Hilberg, a German-speaking Jew who fled Nazism, was hired by the New Yorker to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann after his arrest and kidnapping in Argentina by Israeli Mossad agents. For Arendt, Eichmann was unexceptional in every way, a follower who was neither ideologically motivated nor a psychopath, but rather a, quote, terrifyingly normal man who was simply following orders. Although more recent scholarship has clearly shown that Arendt was duped by Eichmann's "I was but a cog in the wheel" argument, nonetheless his image epitomized the faceless bureaucrat, indeed a desktop killer, whose management of train schedules was part and parcel of the systematic murder of millions. Combined with the praise heaped on Stanley Milgram's 1963 psychology experiments on obedience, in which he famously claimed, quote, men are led to kill with little difficulty, then one can understand that in this context of a few years, you begin to get a sense of how influential this interpretation of Holocaust perpetrators was. And if you don't keep up with this sort of stuff, I should note that about 5 years ago, people started looking into Milgram's research a little bit more clearly, and it's largely been overturned. He was rather sloppy, even if we like what his point was saying. He tended to manipulate much of his own research. Chinks in the armor of the faceless bureaucrat argument began to appear in the 1980s and 90s, what I'm going to call our phase 3. With studies that eschewed viewing the perpetrator as a monolithic collective and began interrogating the motivations of smaller groups of perpetrators and even individuals. Taking their cue from the growing literature on victims, which demonstrated clearly that there was no one single victim experience, so why should there be one single perpetrator experience? These scholars sought to answer the question, why did so many kill? A landmark contribution to perpetrator studies came in 1992 with Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland. His close reading of court documents suggested a staggering new interpretation. These men, mostly older, non-party members from the least Nazified part of Germany, the city of Hamburg, killed not out of extreme ideological devotion, that is rabid anti-Semitism, nor did they fear being charged with treason, but out of a constellation of what he called situational factors, namely solidarity with fellow officers, a radicalized war environment, and just following orders. Browning's thesis is startling because he suggests that if you or I or our students were put in the same situation, roughly 85% of us, because only 10 to 15% refuse to kill, we would murder defenseless men, women, and children. Other studies in this phase have looked at other groups of perpetrators, from doctors to Wehrmacht soldiers to concentration camp guards and other police organizations, all finding nuanced, specific motivations based on that historical context. We are still in this third phase of understanding perpetrator motivations as complex and situational because it articulates, I would argue, history as it was, multifaceted, messy, and not monocausal. So what I thought I might do is stop here for a second and talk about what might an assignment look like that I think could be useful in a classroom. And I've given you a handout, and it comes from this text which sadly is no longer in print. but is still easily found. There are lots of really, really cheap copies on the internet. And I've provided as many copies as I could.
We're copying.
Okay, they're copying more, or I can email it. I have it as a file. I can email it as well. This is a collection of documents that does sort of what I'm doing here. Takes the different historical perspectives on a variety of subjects, and then allows students in a very kind of streamlined fashion way to get at the central arguments of these debates. And I've given you the chapter from the Knee-White text on perpetrators. And you'll notice that right at the beginning of that text, there are 3 quotes, which are basically kind of the thesis of each one of these works. Each one of these little snippets comes from a larger, really big book. One snippet is from Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, maybe. One snippet is from another book that uses the same exact source materials, that is, the court records of this police battalion and other police battalions, and it's a very famous, or perhaps infamous now, book called Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen. And the second comes from somebody who was interested not in the people who were shooting in the pits or running concentration camps, but actually the doctors. What would those people who took, how did those people who took a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, how did they become killers? How did they do those experiments in the camps? How did they euthanize individuals? And that's what that piece that I have there is. And so what I thought is I would provide it to you because you could do with it as you would want. You could have students read all 3 of them. You could choose 2 of them. You could build some sort of a module on them, getting students to think about the different ways in which they come to these arguments. And of course, for me, the most important thing I always tell my students that I teach them is not history, but how to think critically. That is, what are the arguments? What are the weaknesses in the arguments? Is there bias in the argument? Can we shoot holes in the arguments? And it would be very clear, very easy, I think, to do so, especially with the second piece, the Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners. The point that he makes is the exact opposite of what Browning makes. It's not that it was situational factors that led people to kill. To simplify, Daniel Goldhagen says it was rabid German exterminationist anti-Semitism that drove the Holocaust. And of course, scholars have since wondered what happened to that German exterminationist anti-Semitism. Did it end with the war too, if it was the driving factor? And then of course, perhaps most problematically is we also might bring in those French, those Italians, those Ukrainians, those Poles, those Lithuanians, who also were perpetrators in the Holocaust. Did they too, somehow through osmosis, have German extreme anti-Semitism? And of course the answer is no, they did it because of their own specific situational factors. So now let me move on and let's look very quickly at the scholarship on bystanders. Luckily for you, the scholarship on bystanders is much, much smaller. It's more limited, but in many ways I would argue it's more confounding, as the lines can be far more fuzzy and stringent definitions harder to lay out. Indeed, what is a bystander? In most of the early scholarship on the Holocaust, bystanders were largely nowhere to be found. They were too busy kind of figuring out what happened in the Holocaust. Who were the victims? Who were the perpetrators? And so that makes a lot of sense. But it's also interesting that the vast majority of Europeans were bystanders. The vast majority of Germans were bystanders. The vast majority of Poles were bystanders. By the 1970s, as the denazification program in Germany was wrapping up, the war trials in the various countries were coming to a close, the scholarship on bystanders began to characterize them as a collective group again, just like our perpetrators in its early stages. But this collective was the entirety of the international community and the individual citizens, groups, and companies who made it up, and apparently stood idly by for one reason or another as the genocide progressed. Bystanders were leaders like FDR, Pope Pius XII, banks or corporations, and human rights organizations. As more research followed, the demarcations between what was traditionally understood to be a bystander, that is someone, and here I'm using the legal definition because it often comes out of the court trials afterwards, is, quote, present, a bystander is, quote, present when an event takes place, but does not become directly involved in it, end quote. And the degrees of complicity or resistance were harder to square when you start asking this sort of question or applying that definition. One need not wield a can of Zyklon B to be a perpetrator or have hid Jews in a barn to be a resistor, after all. This is the confounding part of bystander studies. There are gradations, a continuum on which bystanders fall. The motives, knowledge, and circumstantial factors that undergirded their passivity are all taken into account and allows them in many ways to be plotted on that continuum, skewed either towards the extremes of apathetic non-participation on one side or indirect complicity on the other side. Where do we plot the Polish train conductor who did his job by delivering Jews to Nazi-specified destinations? The Ukrainian interpreter who, by aiding the invading forces, saved his family. The German people who moved into that newly available apartment on the corner that belonged to that nice Jewish family. Or the Swiss banks that benefited from Nazi larceny. The task is difficult when we consider the Holocaust as part of that moral failure of the Western civilized world that I mentioned before. We seem to be, as the scholar Victoria Barnett has said, at, quote, an unsatisfying stalemate about the most appropriate terminology to describe patterns of behavior during the Holocaust by those who were neither victims nor perpetrators. Even if scholars can't agree, and that's basically where we're at right now, the bystander category, I would argue, is still useful to explore in the classroom. And I thought we might explore something a little different. Can I access the internet through there, that website? So let me, yeah, okay. Can you pull up while you're doing that, yeah, just pull up the website and I'll start talking. Yeah, that link that I sent. So what I thought I've found useful in my own classroom was to explore the issue of bystanders by looking at a project that is being promoted currently by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. called the History Unfolded Project. Is anybody familiar with it? Just a few people? Okay, good, so I'm actually going to teach you something. I'm going to get my commission check after all tonight. The United States Memorial Holocaust Museum's History Unfolded project began about 3 years ago as a crowdsourcing project, in its own words, to, quote, ask students, teachers, and history buffs throughout the United States what was possible for Americans to have known about the Holocaust as it was happening and how Americans responded. Moreover, the intended purpose of the project is to move beyond the traditional European-centered view of the Holocaust and incorporate it into the socio-economic and political fabric of American society. In so doing, participants are forced to confront complex, contradictory, and thorny issues along the way. The main thrust of the History Unfolded project is relatively straightforward. Contributors are urged to comb their local archives, repositories, libraries, and digitized newspaper collections to find articles and opinion pieces about specific Holocaust-related events that took place in the United States and Europe. These local finds are then scanned and uploaded into a searchable database by the museum. And at present, the database centers around 5 general categories: American racism and anti-Semitism, intervention versus isolation, Americans respond to the Nazi threat, actions of the US government, and finally, the 5th one, the Holocaust. The 5 categories are then subdivided into 34 more specific themes. You go to menu, maybe. You find the cursor. Drop that down and browse events, please. These themes, or these events, run the gamut from the Jewish boycott to the Berlin Olympics, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, Father Coughlin, the Evian Conference, and Executive Order 9066, ordering Japanese internment. To date, there are roughly 3,000 people who have contributed more than 17,000 articles. At the core of this History Unfolded project lies this idea of citizen history, this idea that all of us, and I guess I count as a professional historian, but non-professional historians can and should do real history. That is, do real search that is going to impact history and become part of the historical record. To make good on their understanding of citizen history, from its inception, this crowdsourcing project was meant to be an important part of a planned exhibition entitled Americans and the Holocaust, which I'm happy to say just opened in April of this year. So if you go to the exhibit in Washington, D.C., there's also an online version of it. I'm sure you'll be able to find. You are taking in a narrative about the Holocaust that is created by students in classrooms just like yours and mine. Now that I've done this assignment a couple times, it seems to me that there's a theme emerging, and that theme is namely perplexity. That is, students are perplexed. They're surprised by a few things. 3, I'm going to suggest. Students are surprised at just how much Nazism and the Holocaust were covered in American newspapers, even local ones. Students are surprised, number 2, just how early credible information about the persecution and genocide was made available to Americans. And number 3, students are surprised at just how rarely these stories made the front pages and how uneven the coverage could be. The usefulness of this project lies in the fact that most students begin to realize that their research challenges a common misperception, and not just my students. As one New York City student wrote, quote, "I'm astonished that our country, which I have always thought of as one to fight for the rights of all humans, knew of these events and didn't immediately take action." I love historical blinders sometimes. When local newspapers of Middle America, not the large urban centers where, by the way, most of our current knowledge about the media comes from, report on these events time and again, students ask salient questions. If the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette runs an article in March 1933 on the opening of Dachau, the concentration camp, and a local paper in Battle Creek, Michigan, runs an article in December 1942 stating eyewitnesses are reporting the murder of nearly 1 million Jews in, quote, human slaughterhouses in Poland, is the oft-touted claim, both here and there, how could we have known, legitimate? So that's one part of the usefulness. Students begin to realize the common misperceptions that they have are there for a reason, and they have to figure out what that reason is. That's the harder part, too, for me to get my students to learn. That is, I have trouble getting my students to figure out how their particular article or theme fits into the overall larger narrative of the Holocaust. They often miss the forest for the trees, I like to say. Now that there's an online exhibition that they can go through, I think I'm going to have my solution for this, because this provides the broader historical context to connect the various seemingly disparate themes all together. As the exhibit curator Daniel Green has said, quote, "The exhibition shows also, what else was on Americans' minds as they learned about these threats. We transport visitors back into that tumultuous era so that they might consider these events without the benefit of hindsight. As students wrestle with factors like economic unease, national security, prejudice, and isolationism, they can come to understand the complicated realities behind American inaction and even the newsworthiness of Shoah or Holocaust-related events. Lastly, by connecting the larger world with local history, the exhibition serves as a useful springboard into contemporary problems. And I'll just give you one example that I think you might find useful in the classroom. In 1939, Fortune magazine polled people asking the question about the fate of European Jewry. 91% of Americans were disturbed by the situation facing European Jews, but only 20% believe Jewish immigrants should be allowed in the country in larger numbers. And I think that would be a nice springboard to talk about refugees and asylum seekers today. Sometimes students are shocked by what they find, such as an AP Wired article claiming in 1933, quote, "Mistreatment of Jewish race in Germany ends." And sometimes, to end on a high note, teachers are heartened by their students' abilities and reflections. Such was the case in my course last year when the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. contacted one of my students to inform him that one of the articles he unearthed will be part of the exhibition in Washington. And it's displayed on a computer kiosk there. He noted to me later on in an email, quote, "It's incredible how history shifts. Irony is an understatement, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark." He was referencing the fact that he felt as though he was making a meaningful contribution to Holocaust history in the 21st century in the United States. Yet he grew up hearing stories of 3 family patriarchs who joined the Hitler Youth, the Luftwaffe, and the SS, respectively. Thank you. Oh, Esther, do I have one more thing? Can I have like 1 more minute, 2 more minutes? Good. Can we pull the... Yeah. I wanted to show you one other thing that I thought might be useful that I just sort of stumbled across. One of the other things that I think is useful about the project is, especially in an area like us where we have so many different newspapers, especially ethnic newspapers, we can really get a variety of points of view. And one of the interesting things is if you look at African American newspapers in particular, they have a very different understanding of what asylum seeking and refugees and the debate were, and this is epitomized by this cartoon that was found in one of the, it's called the Pittsburgh Courier, I believe is the name of the newspaper, an African American newspaper, which you can see on the right how they view the American stance and American isolationism and question whether they should be helping out refugees or should they be helping people at home. So I use this to suggest you could get as complicated and as in-depth as you want, or you could, I mean, you can have students find their own articles, you can find articles for them. It's lucky we have an expert who can find digitized collections for you if you're having trouble doing that. It's very easy to find these things, and you know, you can do comparisons of all types. I would argue Jewish and non-Jewish papers would be a really interesting comparison to do. Why is it that Jewish newspapers tended to not put so many statistics and emphasize the Jewish nature of Nazism? You know, these are kind of debates that you could have in maybe what I might call a more sophisticated class, but we could ratchet it back as well. Thank you. You have questions for me? I think I could answer 1 or 2. Good.
How would you handle the students' eventual conclusion that a bystander was indeed therefore a perpetrator?
How do I deal with that fact?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm in the mainstream. I have a bit of a problem not understanding, but realizing, especially people who were in close proximity, that there were any bystanders. It's hard to make the argument that if you were German in the 1930s and you were a party member, that you were a bystander in any way. You know, even if you weren't pulling a trigger or not. It's a difficult one, I'll be honest with you. It's a difficult one. The bystander issue is, as I said, because it has this kind of ethical or moral element to it, where do you stop being a bystander? That is, where were you passive? And where do you start being complicit? So that kind of stream of questions that I asked, you know, if you think about it in legal terms, and this is one of the ways that I've done it in my own classes, is I say, are all perpetrators the same? Should they be treated the same? the person who drove the trains, the person who was manning gas chambers, or somebody like Eichmann who is counting people and running train schedules. How do we measure that? And of course, we have an example in the Nuremberg trials and these sorts of things. It's measured, but it's not particularly done well, and it's not done in any sort of even way. It's sort of taken on a case-by-case basis, and I think that's the easiest way, or the way that is needed to approach bystanders is we have to have all the information before we could render some sort of a judgment. You have to know what their motives were. Did they get that apartment? Did that German couple get that apartment by ratting out the nice Jewish couple on the corner? And we know that's how the Gestapo worked. It worked largely on people giving up information to them. It wasn't some vast police network or spy network that they had. They relied on bystanders.
You touched on this. How do you relate to African American students, Hispanic students, and Asian students to make this real for them in this area?
One of the ways, I think, and one of the reasons why I like this project in particular is because we have newspapers from many of those communities, so you can see how their own communities were covering this. With African Americans, I find it rather easy. I mean, I've done things in the past, so there's a book, the title of which is escaping me right now. It's also been made into a movie. Something like From Swastika to Jim Crow, and it talks about German Jewish professors who, after the 1933 civil service law, were kicked out of Germany, and many of them came to the United States. And the only place, because of American anti-Semitism, that they could get jobs were in historically black colleges in the South. And both the book and the movie explore that, how Jews in rural American Jim Crow South don't fit in either world. In fact, many in the black community called them some kind of black folk because they didn't quite fit in with the whites, and they weren't quite African American either, right? So that would be one of the instances. I think I would try to find those types of ways to make it accessible to them. If you were on my campus last year, maybe I know some of you, some familiar faces, were at the exhibit that I did on the Shanghai Jewish Museum. Erica, I see you nodding your head because I know Erica was there. That would be one way I might bring in an Asian component to it. Shanghai was a haven for one of the few places in the world that would take Jews when, for example, America or France or England had largely closed their doors to Jewish asylum seekers. So that would be the way. So I would kind of pick and choose my things. That's the two examples that come off the top of my head.
If you don't see anti-Semitism as a major catalyst for perpetrators, where do you put it?
I tend to see anti-Semitism as a major catalyst. Browning sees it as a catalyst, but not the most important one in this specific context. And we have to think he's studying a group of 150 people at most. Just because he doesn't see evidence of rampant anti-Semitism there doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if we look at other works, especially on the military and in SS organizations, the ideological anti-Semitism is very clear and very relevant and maybe much more pronounced as a factor.
In the 1930s, after 33, maybe 35, Ohio newspaper published a very, very short article on this organization called Jews for Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, yeah.
And, I mean, was their idea that if we go along with this, maybe things will not happen to us if we show support?
To be honest with you, I am not. The article was called Jews for Hitler. It was an article published in, I think it might have been one of these kind of like AP Wired articles. I think it probably appeared in more than just an Ohio newspaper. And there were a small group of German Jews who thought that America should side with the Germans. They thought they were on the right side of history. They were going to win any impending war. I don't know, to be honest with you, I don't know any of the intricacies or the detailed knowledge of the group. But, there was a Cleveland Nazi Party as well. And so there were lots of people who who saw something to believe in Germany in the 1930s. In the 1940s, maybe not so much.
Yeah, but these Jews were in Germany. That was their organization, and it just threw me.
This is something new. I don't know about this one.
I'll try to look it back up. It's on newspapers.com.
If you will send it to me, I'll send it to Mark.
Yeah.
You can send it to everybody.
Yeah, I'll try to find that.
Yeah, I'd be
again.
interested in
I
that.
have his email.
May I say something?
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have in the room a couple of survivors, a couple of second generation, and a couple of third generation individuals. This is Mr. George Folger.
If you think about it, when Roosevelt was the president of the United States and the St. Louis sheep, the story everybody knows, yeah, and they wanted to come to United States because Cuba didn't want to let them to go to Cuba. And Roosevelt denied that. Yeah. Or I am a Hungarian Jew. Yeah. And that was time in 1943 when we have a prime minister who was for England. That was 1943. And he sent diplomat or politician to Churchill, that if Churchill and Roosevelt would attack from south means Yugoslavia, Albania, yeah, and Churchill denied it. He said, we have our plan, yeah.
This is what makes that bystander issue really difficult, because the ethical or moral component comes in, and Churchill and FDR tended to take the side that the way we save the most lives is by winning the war the fastest. It's not taking men, material, money, and using it to save one group. Now, you each make your mind up about that argument, right? And that's the ethical or moral component of it. And nobody is going, in a group like this, it's not going to split 50-50 or 60-40. It would probably be very polarized, and in any group that would be. And that's what I think makes the bystander studies, or the issue of the bystander, a particularly pricky one to deal with, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of this.
So, I'm Louise Freilich, and I direct the face-to-face Holocaust education program at Congregation Shari Tikva, and it's a field trip program. It's a 3-hour program that happens on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. We do have spaces for schools, so my information is, well, there's a flyer about the program in your packets, and my information for contacting me is there, so please do that. So I'm very pleased to moderate this panel with multiple generations, and I know Erica quite well because she speaks not only at the Maltz Museum but also for Face-to-Face, and for many years, and I know Julia from her grandfather also was a speaker for us, and and I've known Marilyn along the way too, at various things. And Erica is always at whatever Holocaust event there is in the community, and it's like if you go to a Holocaust event, there's Erica. You can expect to see her. So I'm going to start with Erica and then go down the line, and I think each person has about 15 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. So, Erica, so when did you start speaking about your experiences?
To my family, they always knew it. But to schools, I didn't have the opportunity to go until I retired, which was in 1997. And then I was able to go to schools or like the Marx Museum opened in 2005, and so that's a convenient place to go because they bring in busloads of kids. But I always, if somebody asked me the question, I always told them the truth, whatever happened. Unfortunately, most people did not ask. I don't know if they didn't want to know or they were too embarrassed to ask. I actually went to high school in Cleveland Heights, and I always wondered, did the people who went, the other kids, did they know there were 3 Holocaust survivors at the same time at Heights High? I don't know if they knew who we were or why we were different or whatever, but nobody ever asked.
Thank you. Was there a single event that led you to speak, or just a sense over time that the history could be lost?
Actually, when the first time one of the teachers from Kenston, who happens to be part of our congregation that I go to, Temple Israel Ner Tamid, asked me to come to her class. And at that time, that was the first time, and I was kind of shy to even, I never thought I'm going to be able to talk to classes, but then I got used to it, and it's very important. I'm always amazed that the kids just, no matter what age, they just sit there motionless, and there is no sound. I mean, they're really listening. Some of them might have their eyes closed, but they are listening. And I'm going to tell you one of the stories that I probably told you, Louise, because it happened at Shari Tikva. The way the Shari Tikva, the face-to-face program is set up, the kids come, the rabbi talks to them about Judaism, and then they have a little museum about the Holocaust, and I'll go through the museum, and then they have a little snack, and then the Holocaust, and there is a movie, the Daniel story, that is, no? Okay. At that time there was. And then the Holocaust survivor comes. And I overheard the teacher telling this one kid to make sure that he goes and sits down in the sanctuary, and because the Holocaust survivor is going to be speaking. And he said, do we have to? And the teacher said, yes, you do. So he sat down right in the middle of the front row. And I thought, we're going to have problems here. But he sat there motionless. He closed his eyes. I figured if he's asleep, that's fine, no problem. I finished talking, and he was the first one who stood up, came over to me, thanked me for being there, and shook my hand. And I was amazed. He was listening. Even he was listening. So,
was what you shared with your children different than what you shared with your grandchildren, and in what way?
I don't think so. The only difference is that when my grandchildren were old enough to be in religious school, the school actually invited me in to talk to the class. And when my kids were in school, there was no Holocaust education, except in the Jewish schools and synagogues. So, but now they have, most of the public schools have a program. It is not mandated, but at least some teachers do it, and others, I don't understand. If there is a teacher 1 year that has a good Holocaust class, and then she or he retires, then they don't pick up the ball. I don't understand that, but that's the way it's been working.
Thank you. Why do you continue to speak today, and do you think it's growing less or more important to continue speaking today?
think it was always important, but with all the bullying and all the horrible things that are in the news, I think it might be more important for kids to realize that words matter, and when people say cartoons or even as a joking matter makes fun of somebody, it is not a good thing, and you have to stand up and try to make sure that it doesn't escalate. I feel it's, as long as I can do it, I will. It won't be much longer. I'm already 86. So, but as long as I can go, and the Maltz Museum is walking distance from my house, so I can always get there, so it's charity club.
And the last question for you is, what do you think is the best way for personal stories from the Holocaust to be remembered once there are no living survivors?
I have a feeling videotapes are good enough, but now there is the new technology for the holograms. They have already made 15 holograms in the United States. I don't know how they're going to be distributed in the different cities. We have one here in Cleveland who is lives in Beechwood, and they made a hologram out of him, but he was like number 15. So it's a very expensive, very complicated technology. But if there is and it's expensive, it's very expensive. Not everybody can afford it, but videotapes, I think, would be good enough.
Okay, so we'll move on to Marilyn. So when did you start speaking about the experiences of your parents?
Publicly?
Or privately?
Well, publicly today. For the most part, privately with my children. They were probably 4th, 5th grade. They probably learned at an older age than I did, because I pried information from my mother, and then as a mother, I of course wanted to protect my children. But for the most part, they were probably 4th, 5th grade when they started learning about their grandmother and great-grandparents' experiences. The only other, I would talk to friends and I would talk to other people. I was a religious school teacher. I taught 3rd grade for 12 years. And the one year I happened to have a particularly mature, very empathetic group of kids. And I went to my director at the time and I said, the Yom HaShoah was coming up. I said, I just think this group would get it. Would it be, what do you think? And she knew my mother. I said, what do you think if my mom would come and speak? Who I knew my mother would be hesitant because she doesn't usually speak to anybody that young. And Kate was on board, and she said, we'll send a letter home to the parents, and we'll invite them to stay as well. And it actually was a very meaningful experience. I gave them some prep ahead of time, and obviously you don't discuss a lot of the gory details of what went on. And most of them don't know much about World War II in general at that point. And then fast forward to the program that I believe was happening, the Cleveland commemoration program, maybe the following week. A few of those children, so it was held at Fairmount Temple that year, and there was a play group that met, and they had rehearsals at Fairmount, and there were a couple of the girls that were in the play. They were there for rehearsal, just coincidentally at the same time as this program, and they did ask their director, could they participate? They saw my mom, they knew about the program, and they wondered if they could. There's a portion where we have a March of the Generations, where the younger children will march through. And they wanted to participate, and fortunately the director, it all worked out. But that's the only time I actually spoke in an educational forum, and I certainly don't recommend it if you can't do that on a regular basis with third graders.
When did you first learn about the Holocaust and from whom, and how much was learned at home and how much at school?
So this is 3rd or 4th grade, and my mother, I was at home. My mother was working on a fundraiser for Akron, I believe at the time. Fiddler on the Roof was, in Cleveland. And Fiddler on the Roof was coming to Blossom. And that was the fundraiser. My brother and I were in Run Room playing, and my mother was, I knew she was working on this fundraiser, and she was listening to the music in the other room, whatever she was doing, and then I heard her cry. I'd never heard my mother cry before. Now, I was raised in a somewhat typical Jewish household where the mother worries about everything, and my grandparents were on vacation. So naturally, my mother crying meant that something had happened to my grandparents who were out of the country. So I built up the strength, and I went on over to, I occupied my brother with something who was a little younger than me, and I confronted, Mom, why are you crying? What happened? And that was the beginning. I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was my introduction to Holocaust education of what my family had been through.
And when you were in school, I would imagine there was probably very little.
Very little. Not in public school at all. I went to Jewish day school for a few years, and, religious school, right. Religious school at the higher grades I learned. And I happened to go to Beechwood High School for my public, high school education, which is a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And even there wasn't very much.
And there wasn't,
minimal.
There wasn't at that time.
Right.
We're about
The same age. What impact has being a child of a survivor had on your life?
So I guess growing up, I always knew that my mom and my grandparents were different than my father and his mother. His father had passed away before I came into the picture. They had an accent, which I thought was kind of cool, actually. She was from Europe. I mean, how cool is that? Everybody else's parents were born in Cleveland. My mother worked, and most of my friends' mothers were not working moms, so I thought, well, she's obviously brilliant and cool. But I also know that she spent 6 weeks hiding in their housekeeper's closet, she and my mother, or her mother, I'm sorry, my grandmother, and they ate a chocolate bar for a day or whatever, however long it took you. A long time. They shared that. And they had to hide in this closet, and they were being hidden. So when all my other girlfriends were going shopping at Donna Lee, and they picked out, outfits, and we would go in and maybe shop on the sale rack for a piece here or there, after I got through my tween years of whining about, well, so-and-so gets to do, I don't see why, I would start to think about that chocolate bar. And I believe it helped put things in perspective. Now I'm going to cry, but no, it's okay. When I was, I cry every time I tell this story, it's okay. When I was delivering my first child, the thought going through my head was, how could I possibly protect my child the way my grandmother knew to protect hers? How could anyone be that strong and brilliant and gutsy? That's how it affected my life.
And the gutsy piece is that Erica and her mother were on a truck that was deporting them. And Erica's mother jumped off, winked at Erica, and Erica jumped off. I think that really supports the gutsy comment.
That's exactly what
And do you think it is growing less or more important to continue speaking today?
So I do agree with my mother. Of course, it's very important. I do remember one time you came back from speaking to a group, and I've heard this story too, but you received a thank you note from a young girl who, I don't know if she was African American or what her background was, but she wasn't Jewish, and she wrote the most amazing thank you note, and I'm paraphrasing, but you know what an incredible experience it was to meet you. She'd never met anyone who had such experiences, and she was going to go home and talk to her father, I believe. And she was going to tell her friends, and then she wanted her friends to be able to tell the stories to their friends, and she wanted her father to be able to tell, and cutting myself off, I don't like using the word stories, they're experiences. When you hear the word story or testimony, when you use the word story, to me it sounds like a novel or something. But to me that was so incredible, and that just hit home too, how important it is to continue to talk, and to, as long as we have live survivors, those who maybe are not comfortable speaking in front of a group, but if they can be interviewed, whether it's just audio, whether it's video, the hologram, which I don't know if everybody knows about these holograms and what they are. Stanley is our local hologram. Stanley Burnett. He is amazing, and just the fact that you can speak, whether he's in the room or not, to him and get the answers, to your questions. So yes, it's extremely important to continue to talk.
And Stanley Burnett said last year that he was looking forward to the hologram being tested and to coming and asking himself questions. And what do you think is the best way for personal stories from the Holocaust to be remembered once there are no more living survivors? I guess you pretty much answered that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I did read that ahead of time, and that's what I was thinking about. But also, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump the wagon either, but or jump the boat. When I interviewed one time your grandfather, I was co-chair of the Cleveland Yom HaShoah commemoration program, and we had decided that can I say this?
Yom HaShoah is Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Thank you. But I interviewed your grandfather because we wanted to honor him in the program. And there, so there were certain tidbits that he told me. For instance, I believe it was his father, when your grandfather's sisters had to wear the stars, their father said, "You are going to embroider," right? Did I say it right? "You're going to make those stars so beautiful, and you are going to be so proud to wear these beautiful stars." And that's a story that stuck with me, and everything that goes behind that as well. So I think that's just an example. When people hear these experiences firsthand, for as long as we can firsthand, and then to spread them. I've never met you before, but I've known about you. But it gives me such joy to be able to explain it to you also.
Okay, Julia. Yeah. So Julia has, since we got the questions in advance, she has some prepared remarks. So we're going to let Julia just.
I'll leave time for Louise to ask me about maybe something that I skip over. When I was 6 years old, I had a tantrum at the kitchen table because my grandmother, who was visiting Cleveland from Phoenix, had taken too much of my other grandmother's homemade cranberry sauce, and I was worried that there would not be enough left for me to eat with my chicken cutlet. As I whined and shrieked, my grandmother began to cry. My mother quickly escorted me from the table to explain privately that I was being rude and selfish, but also to emphasize that my words were particularly hurtful to my grandmother, who, when she was just a teenager, had been imprisoned and suffered from near starvation. That was the first time I learned about the Holocaust. I would soon learn that 3 of my grandparents were survivors. My maternal grandparents, Anna and Harry Spitz, did not discuss the Holocaust often, though I soon understood the broad contours of their experiences. My paternal grandfather, Jacob Hennenberg, discussed his experiences often and felt it was very important to educate the world about what happened to him and so many others. From the day he was liberated at the age of 21 from Waldenburg concentration camp, he began gathering bits and pieces of documentary evidence in order to preserve the memory of his family and his experiences during the war. Wherever he traveled, he sought out anything that represented his family: a signature on a document, a return address on an envelope, a school report card, the rare picture or letter. These precious items became the family album, his only link to a father, 3 sisters, and dozens of other family members who had been murdered. Over a period of decades, he slowly recounted his experiences in short stories, sorry, Eric, that he would handwrite in all capital letters. In 6th grade, I learned to type, and he would ask me every so often to type something for him. "Papa, can't you write in lowercase?" I once asked him. I could type a lot faster that way. But the stories kept coming in caps. I learned later he did not really want me to type faster. The capitalization forced me to truly read what he wrote. He often noted that by writing and speaking about his experiences, he gave the reader or listener a memory of his memory that could live on. Capitalizing the words and having me type them was his way of ensuring that those memories took hold in the firmament of my mind, so that I would be able to speak for him long after he departed. Many of the stories my grandfather had me type have had a lasting impact on my life, but there are a couple in particular that stand out. My grandfather often recalled a moment in 1944 when he was in a concentration camp, waiting for his identification number to be given to him. His faith in God remained strong, and he thought that maybe he could survive if he received the number 18. Although his wistful longing seemed like foolishness, given that the Nazi identification system at Waldenburg concentration camp at that time started with the number 64,000, he clung to the significance of the number 18, written in Hebrew with the letters Het Yud, which also spell Chai, meaning life in the Hebrew language. When he returned to his barracks to work on memorizing his number, as they had all been instructed to do, he was pleased to discover that his tattooed number was 64242. The sum of each single digit equals 18. If I close my eyes tightly, I can vividly see the olive green numbers on his forearm, wrinkled by the force of time. Those numbers, and the meaning my grandfather ascribed to them, blaze with hope, optimism, and the spirit needed to triumph over evil. After his liberation, he traversed Europe by foot, by bicycle, and occasionally by train, searching for a trace of his family. Eventually, he was reunited with his sole surviving sister at a displaced person camp in Germany, and she told him what had happened to their family after he was seized for forced labor in May of 1941. In February 1943, still in the Krzanów ghetto, where his family was forced to live at the time, the entire Jewish population was ordered to assemble on the Sportplatz, where SS soldiers with submachine guns were waiting to separate them into two groups. Initially, my grandfather's 4 sisters were placed on the left side, with other men and women that were fit to work in forced labor. My grandfather's father was placed on the right side, with the elderly and other individuals considered undesirable. An SS soldier ordered my grandfather's oldest sister, Sabina, to leave her baby girl, Pearl, on the ground. When she refused, she and her baby were forced to the right. Her twin sister, Hannah, also refused to leave her baby. She clasped hands with Sabina and was shoved to the right as well. On the ground, a stranger's baby, presumably abandoned, was wailing in terror. My grandfather's other sister, Ita, picked up the baby, at which point Ita was directed to the right also. Carola, holding hands with Ita, was tugged back to the left by other Jews who knew she would be going to a certain death if she were to follow her 3 other sisters. They were correct, as those on the right side were all sent swiftly to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. This account of my family's murder and the choices they were forced to make on that day is seared into my consciousness and affects the way I live my life. One small example is that no matter how tired I am, I cannot let my children cry alone in the middle of the night. If Ita could give her life to comfort a stranger's baby for its final moments, how can I not comfort my own children at any hour and for however long they need? To me, the Holocaust is not just a great historical tragedy. It is a deeply personal one. The story of my grandfather's survival is not simply a harrowing tale of a man that beat the odds. It is the story of a man who fought for me to exist. The story of Hitler is not simply the story of absolute power run amok. It is the story of a man who committed unspeakable atrocities to prevent my existence and the existence of anyone like me. The story of Sabina's, Hannah's, and Ita's final moments isn't just a horrific example of human cruelty. It is a story that my mind replays on an endless reel of vivid nightmares. Having a family member that was a victim of the Holocaust or hearing stories directly from a Holocaust survivor have proven to be powerful ways to teach new generations about that time. But my papa is now gone, and soon there will be no more survivors. The moment that Jews have feared for years is now upon us. Without survivors, how do we teach the Holocaust to young people so they understand it on an emotional level and fully absorb the critical lessons to be learned? How do we prevent it from sounding like just another terrible event in a long line of terrible historical events? Literature, films, and visits to Holocaust museums are certainly helpful for understanding the human element of the Holocaust. But I would argue that conveying the human suffering that occurred is pointless if it is not joined with a rigorous understanding of what led to the Holocaust and the sobering lesson that it is each student's personal responsibility to stop the next Holocaust. The Holocaust and World War II generally were the product of various preconditions: a worldwide economic depression, German grievances following World War I, a fear of communist Russia. But the overriding cause of such bloodshed and horror was the fact that hate found a home in the leadership of the most advanced country on earth. A leader elected without a majority of the vote used the common trick of blaming a nation's problems on some of its most vulnerable inhabitants, and used technology and propaganda to further his vision and spread his message far and wide. And all the while, otherwise good men and women downplayed the dangers posed by such rhetoric until it was too late. They didn't have the blazing example of the Holocaust to show them the end result of unfettered scapegoating, bullying, and discrimination. But we do. The most important lesson for young people about the Holocaust is that by learning its lessons, they learn to preserve their future. They learn to spot dangerous leaders and trends and when to sound the alarm. They learn that it is never too early for them to engage politically and that every election matters. That standing up for minorities and vulnerable people, wherever they may live and however they may look, is not just the right thing to do, but it is critical to keeping the forces of ignorance and hate weak and marginalized. They learn that bullying, hateful speech, and disrespectful behavior by a single person can light the fuse that eventually inflames mankind, but that through kindness, caring, respect, and civic engagement, they can stomp it out. In the tearful closing remarks of his USC Shoah Foundation testimony, my grandpa Harry instructed his grandchildren to be good citizens, to get an education, and to be an example of kindness to all different people, no matter their race, color, or religion, so that there may never be hatred again in the world. Thank you.
I don't have any questions for you, but I do want to tell a story about Jacob's number and a story about Face to Face. When he spoke at Face to Face, the first year that I was director of Face to Face, one of the students, during questions and answers, asked him, "Can I see your number?" Because he had told that story about the numbers adding up to 18. And so he pulled up his sleeve and showed his number. And the student said, "Way cool." And I nearly died. And sort of my jaw dropped. And like, what do I say? What do I do? And I sort of said, it wasn't a choice. But your grandfather was okay with it. And then I had to ask everybody, what does way cool mean? What does it mean when 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds say way cool? And so I got opinions about that. I mean, not at that moment, but later, to try to.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So my grandfather, in his accounts of what happened to him, always would share with me and whoever would listen the one positive thing that happened. And so for the students to say way cool is interesting because he recounted a story actually to me that it was very good that he got the number tattooed on his arm, because not everyone at Waldenburg concentration camp did get tattooed. He had volunteered to leave the camp and go work on putting in iron bars in the food storage area, the food that they were saving for the Nazi guards and other Germans. And so he got tattooed so that he couldn't escape, so that they were able to keep track of him better. And so, in a way, it was very cool that he got tattooed. And he was able to take some of the food from the food storage area for himself while he was putting in the iron bars, and that's one of the reasons he survived.
And the other story that I remember about, or memory I have of your grandfather, was of him having these long arguments with Arnold Friedman, who was another survivor, and they would talk about where was God and whether God existed or didn't exist, and they had different opinions about it. But it was very interesting listening to them, because they would come in together sometimes to talk to me or whatever in the early years. And Arnold Friedman passed away long before your grandfather, but I was remembering that also. Do you have the list of resources? Is it in the folder, or are they getting it later? Or
That's your question.
Those
Yeah.
resources, everyone should have gotten it as they came in.
We'll
okay.
give you the things that were on the tab.
Okay, I didn't see. But, and is the list of the videos from the Holocaust Museum, from the face-to-face videos on it?
Yeah.
So Erica's video is on it, and as is Jacob Hennenberg's. So you can go to that site from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we did a video project of 25 of our speakers speaking at face-to-face to a teen audience specifically, and those videos are on the online archives of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And so you can use that link to get to any of those videos, but you might especially want to hear Erica's whole story and Jacob Hennenberg's whole story. Yeah, we can take questions.
I would like to piggyback on Professor Cole's statement about the bystanders. And as I'm getting older, I realized that one place where we never heard anything before, after the Holocaust, was about the trains. When they took the people on trains, you just assume that it was a train for people, but they were cattle cars. And it blows my mind that nobody in those towns, villages, big towns, little towns, nobody objected and nobody said anything about it. So they had to see it. I mean, there is no way they didn't see it, but nobody said anything.
Anybody have questions?
I want to follow up the Eisenhower story, man, where Eisenhower forced the people in the community to walk through the camps, was exactly the same issue. He just, it was impossible for him to accept the idea that they didn't know what was going on. And my question really is that how do we explain to teenagers? You said you spoke to teenagers today. How do we explain that? How do we explain the bystanders to a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old?
I mean, about bullying, you can kind of talk about bullying, and if you hear somebody tell somebody a nasty comment, you should try to speak up. I mean, that's the only way you can relate. I don't know.
I think one great resource is the ADL's Pyramid of Hate. Okay, so yeah, okay, so that starts at the bottom and then goes up to the top with genocide at the top. So you don't start. The emphasis is on that. It doesn't start with genocide. It's, we have to start, at the beginning, and where did it start, and what led up to it, and yeah. So this is the Pyramid of Hate, ADL, and they have a website as well that that has some lesson plans for teachers. And it starts with biased attitudes, and then acts of bias, and then it goes up to discrimination, then it goes up to bias-motivated violence, and then it goes up to genocide. So I think using that, can help a lot. I think looking at the early part, before the genocide, what was between 1933 and 1939, before World War II started. And I think Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which was November 9th, 1938, is very important because it was the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end. And maybe at that point, something could have been different.
I'm just going to share another resource. If you're not familiar with Echoes and Reflections,
yes.
It's absolutely incredible. And if you have the opportunity to go to a training so they can really teach you about the tools and everything that they have, it's absolutely a wonderful curriculum. It has all of this stuff in it.
Yeah, and to add to that, which I was going to mention, from Echoes of Reflection was done by ADL, Yad Vashem, and the Shoah Foundation. And after Echoes in Reflection, which is a multimedia curriculum, which is very fine and very organized and has lots of video clips of survivors, the Shoah Foundation then went on to develop the little eyewitness site. An eyewitness, you're probably going to talk about this later. So
you have the links on your resources.
Yeah, so the link is on your resource handout. But little eyewitness site that the Shoah Foundation did, when the Shoah Foundation did the Shoah movie, they took testimony from 55,000 survivors and some liberators and some perpetrators and various people. And they have taken, so the eyewitness site is for teachers and their students, and they've taken more than 1,500 of those videos, put them onto this site. They have they've cataloged the whole thing so that your students can put in a search term such as Kristallnacht or Kindertransport or Auschwitz or labor camps or whatever, and they can find short clips of survivors talking about those subjects. The students can look at the whole video if they want. They can go back and look at the whole testimony, and those testimonies were 2 to 4 hours. But they can also take a few of those clips, and there's built-in video editing software, so a student can do a video journal where they take a few of the clips, and they've done their research, and they do a response piece so that they get their own little video about whatever the topic is rather than writing a paper. So those things are, very helpful, and I think eyewitness will go a long way when survivors are not around.
I think those are good resources for community members. I mean, anybody here who's not teaching, but you want to look at these resources because you want to talk to young people in your lives about these topics. But I also wonder, to your question about how do you engage 15-year-olds.
That's
how. I wonder about so many schools, not all schools certainly, but many schools embrace the notion of allies. And so they'll have a group that's, LGBTQ and their allies. And I wonder if there isn't something, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I wonder if there isn't something in this movement to create allied communities that is an opportunity for addressing these kinds of circumstances in which people are othered. And so if you can declare yourself an ally and you don't stand alone in that, maybe that's something that we need to think about as educators and community members, and something that we can encourage. Because I think if you're not standing alone and standing up, that's an easier position to come from. I don't know.
I think also, I was talking to Rebecca Earl-Belding, who was one of the people who was responsible for she works at the works at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and America in the Holocaust is part of her. She did it with somebody else, so it's her thing. And she was telling me that there was an exhibit at the Holocaust Museum about bystanders a few years ago, and she told me that the term that they use now is witnesses, because because people witnessed various things, and and bystanders, people weren't always in the same position throughout the period of the Holocaust. So sometimes they might have been bystanders at the beginning, and then something happened where a friend came to them and wanted food or wanted to be hidden or something that made them turn them into to helping with resistance in some way. And the children, the German children who joined Hitler Youth, we have to understand that if we had been there and been children, we would have joined Hitler Youth too. And Jewish children wanted to join Hitler Youth, and they couldn't. But it was compelling. It was Girl Scouts. It was Boy Scouts. It was the thing to do. There was lots of music. It was propaganda. But it was there. You know, there was something very exciting about all your classmates being involved in that. So we have. I don't think we can be. I don't think we can be sure of what we would have done if we had been in those situations. Further questions?
Yeah. The short version of my question to the panel is the role of the state of Israel in the history and the future lessons from the Holocaust. I think Americans should look at Israel as a beacon in the Middle East, as a democracy, and but surrounded by many external threats. And Julia, you mentioned particularly, what lessons, what should we take from the Holocaust? What role and what perception should we have of the state of Israel in this situation?
Is there any other educator in the room that would like to take that one?
Unfortunately, during the Holocaust, we did not have the state of Israel. If we had the state of Israel, then they would have let all the people who wanted to get out of Germany in the 30s, before the war started. Hitler let the people out, but nobody let them in. So in that case, we would have been saved. But it came too late. But now, hopefully, it will stay where it is, in freedom and peace. And people can count on having Israel their backs.
I don't know how many of you know, but there's a program of the National Council of Jewish Women that goes into schools, primarily 6th grade, to teach children about Israel and to introduce them to Israel so that they'll know that it is a democracy and all the sort of good things that are going on in Israel. And
well, I guess my question, I asked the question a little bit more from the standpoint of, all right, the Holocaust is widely known, accepted by virtually everybody. And what is the lesson? And I think it has to be articulated in a way. It shouldn't have to be because of the horrors and the huge tragedy of the Holocaust. We should be able to come to a logical conclusion that says, never more. We're going to do what we have to do to make sure this never happens again. But I don't hear that from very often in Holocaust presentations, that maybe Israel, the word or the message has to be, Israel, please stay armed to the teeth ×5, so that we're never in a vulnerable position that we were, 70, 80 years ago. Maybe that's not the message that the Jewish community wants to send, but it just occurs to me, and I have this question as to.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I think that Jews certainly Israel is a place to go if terrible things happen, and certainly a lot of Jews from France are heading to Israel these days. But I think there's also that I think Jews, and especially young Jews, don't want to. Judaism is a lot more than the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is a very important piece of our history. But there's thousands of years of Jewish history, and one of the things to look at in studying the Holocaust is what was life like for Jews before the Holocaust, and I think that's a piece of Holocaust studies. I think that's where.
If you all feel like I do, there's no word to thank you all. Incredible.
Okay, so most of you are educators, so you talk to your kids. One of the things I always try to tell the students about the rescuers. There were so many different ways that people tried to rescue Jews. Of course, there wasn't enough, but we have to give credit to all those righteous Gentiles that took their own life in jeopardy in order to save somebody that they might not even know. There was the kinder transport. There were the diplomats. There was a big exhibit in the Cleveland Library downtown about the visas for life. By that time, they have named over 100 of these diplomats that never talked about it. They were giving out protective papers. There were convents they were saving Jewish children. And there were individuals. So we have to tell the kids that with all the horrible things that happened to the Holocaust, there were some nice people. Thank you.